A world at its peak. The empire had never seemed stronger. From the capital's marble avenues to the farthest provincial towns, there was a shared belief that history itself had chosen this civilization as its final masterpiece. Generations had grown up knowing only peace, expansion, and abundance. War existed, yes, but always far away, always brief, and always ending in victory. To the people of the empire, power was not something to be questioned. It was a natural state of being. At the heart of the empire stood the capital city, a living symbol of dominance and order. Its skyline was defined by towering palaces, vast temples, and monumental arches built to commemorate victories long past. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world, spices from distant deserts, silks from lands beyond the horizon, gold and silver mined from conquered mountains. The streets buzzed with merchants, scholars, soldiers, and officials, each playing their role in a system that seemed flawlessly designed. Political stability was the empire's greatest pride. The ruling council, supported by a powerful monarch, had perfected the art of governance. Laws were codified, taxes efficiently collected, and rebellion swiftly crushed before they could spread. To outsiders, the empire appeared disciplined and united. To its citizens, it felt eternal. Every year, grand ceremonies celebrated the empire's achievements. Triumphs were reenacted in public squares. Generals paraded through the streets, cheered by crowds who believed these victories proved divine favor. Children were taught that the empire's rise was not an accident, but destiny. Schools, temples, and public speeches repeated the same message. The empire was the center of civilization, and everything beyond its borders was lesser, chaotic, and doomed to follow its lead. Economically, the empire flourished beyond imagination. Trade routes stretched across continents, protected by imperial armies and fortified roads. Farmers enjoyed advanced irrigation systems that ensured steady harvests even during harsh seasons. Artisans produced weapons, tools, and luxury goods in quantities never seen before. Coinage was stable, trusted not only within imperial borders, but in foreign markets as well. Wealth flowed upward, but enough trickled down to keep the population content. Bread was affordable, work was plentiful, entertainment, games, festivals, public performances kept the masses distracted and proud. As long as the streets were full and the granaries stocked, few questioned the system that ruled them. Yet beneath this prosperity lay a quiet, dangerous confidence. The empire had grown so powerful that it no longer feared consequences. Leaders believed their institutions were too strong to fail. Military commanders assumed their legions would always outmatch any enemy. Politicians dismissed warnings as pessimism, treating concern as weakness. After all, nothing had gone wrong in living memory. The army was the clearest symbol of this arrogance. Vast and well-equipped, it had not faced a serious threat in decades. Training became routine rather than rigorous. Discipline softened. Promotions were increasingly based on loyalty and family connections rather than merit. Veterans who warned of complacency were honored publicly and ignored privately. Religion, once a moral anchor, also transformed during this golden age. Temples grew richer and more elaborate, but faith shifted from humility to celebration. Gods were praised not for wisdom or restraint, but for victory and domination. Priests preached that the empire's success was proof of divine approval, reinforcing the idea that collapse was impossible. Among the elite, luxury replaced responsibility. Senators and nobles competed not in service, but in extravagance. Estates grew larger, feasts more excessive, and political debates more performative than practical. Decisions were made to preserve comfort rather than long-term stability. problems were postponed, masked by wealth and distraction. The common people noticed changes, but few connected them to danger. Life was still better than it had been for their ancestors. Taxes were manageable, crime was low. Why question an empire that delivered security and pride? Those who did question it were often dismissed as alarmists. Philosophers who spoke of moral decay were mocked. Provincial governors who warned of unrest beyond the borders were told to focus on trade numbers instead of rumors. The empire had grown so accustomed to success that it could no longer imagine failure. Beyond the borders, however, the world was changing. Neighboring kingdoms watched carefully. Some admired the empire, others resented it. Many learned from it. They studied imperial tactics, adopted its technologies, and waited. While the empire celebrated its past victories, new powers were quietly preparing for the future. Inside the empire, cracks began to form, small enough to ignore, but real enough to matter. Inequality widened. Provincial regions felt increasingly exploited by the capital. Soldiers stationed on distant frontiers felt forgotten. Loyalty, once fueled by shared identity, slowly shifted towards personal survival. Yet from the center, none of this seemed urgent. From the palace balconies, the empire still looked magnificent. From the treasury halls, the numbers still impressed. From the public squares, the cheers still echoed. To those in power, history appeared calm, obedient, and predictable. This was the great illusion of the Golden Age. Because true collapse does not begin with fire and invasion. It begins with certainty, with the belief that what exists now will always exist, with leaders who confuse past success with future safety, with people who mistake comfort for permanence.
The illusion of invincibility. For the people of the empire, collapse was not merely unlikely, it was unthinkable. Invincibility had become more than a belief, it was a cultural reflex. From childhood, citizens were surrounded by stories of eternal dominance. Statues of legendary generals filled the public squares. Victories were carved into stone, retold in festivals and reenacted in plays. Defeat, when mentioned at all, belonged to distant enemies or forgotten ages. The empire's narrative was clear. It had always won, therefore it always would. This certainty shaped every layer of society. At the highest level, political leaders governed as if history itself had granted them immunity. Councils debated minor reforms and ceremonial gestures, but fundamental change was avoided. Why risk altering a system that appeared flawless? The empire's institutions were old, respected, and powerful, proof in the minds of its rulers that they were unbreakable. Warnings were not silenced by force, they were dismissed by confidence. Advisors who spoke of overextension were told that borders could always be defended. Economists who cautioned about rising costs and declining productivity were countered with impressive treasury reports. Generals who questioned readiness were reminded of decades without defeat. Each concern was answered not with analysis, but with memory, selective memory, carefully edited to exclude failure. The empire itself became a victim of its own reputation. Its past successes created an aura of inevitability. Soldiers marched with pride, but training exercises lost their urgency. Drills became rituals rather than preparation. Strategy favored tradition over adaptation. New forms of warfare emerging beyond the borders were considered inferior, even primitive, because they did not resemble imperial doctrine. Commanders believed that discipline and numbers alone could overcome any threat. This belief was comforting and fatal. As long as the banners still flew and the legions still paraded through the capital, few noticed the erosion beneath the surface. Equipment maintenance declined. Supply lines grew inefficient. Experienced officers retired, replaced by politically connected heirs. The army looked powerful,
but it was increasingly hollow. Among the elite, invincibility justified excess. The ruling class lived in a world insulated from consequence. Wealth protected them from hardship, and status shielded them from accountability. When policies failed in distant provinces, the costs were invisible in the capital. Taxes increased quietly, resentment grew silently, and loyalty weakened unnoticed. For senators and nobles, the empire's strength was a personal guarantee. Their estates expanded, their banquets grew more extravagant. Public service became a performance rather than a responsibility. As long as the empire stood, their privilege felt secure, and so they invested in comfort instead of correction. Religion reinforced this illusion. Temples preached that the gods favored the empire uniquely. Priests pointed to centuries of dominance as evidence of divine protection. Success was framed as sacred destiny, and questioning the empire's future became, in subtle ways, an act of heresy. Faith was no longer a guide for moral restraint, it was a confirmation of superiority. The idea that the empire could fall conflicted with the belief that the gods had chosen it to rule, and so the idea was rejected, not through censorship, but through ridicule. The common people absorbed these messages deeply. Most citizens had never experienced true instability. Their parents and grandparents had lived under the same banners, laws, and currency. Roads were safe, markets were full. The empire felt permanent, like the mountains or the sea. When hardship appeared, rising prices, conscription, local unrest, it was blamed on individual failure, not systemic weakness. Collapse, after all, was something that happened to others. This mindset was the empire's greatest vulnerability, because when a society believes disaster is impossible, it stops preparing for it. Emergency systems degrade. Redundancies are removed to save cost. Leaders prioritize image over resilience. The future is treated as a continuation of the present rather than a challenge to be faced. Historians would later identify this period as the moment the empire truly began to fall, not when cities burned, but when certainty replaced caution. Outside the empire, perceptions were very different. Rival states did not see an invincible giant. They saw an aging power, slow to adapt and arrogant in its assumptions. They studied imperial weaknesses carefully, overstretched borders, rigid command structures, internal divisions. They observed how the empire underestimated anyone who did not mirror its own methods. While imperial leaders debated tradition, their enemies experimented. While the empire celebrated its past, others prepared for the future. Even within the empire, a few voices recognized the danger. Border commanders wrote reports describing new threats. Philosophers warned that moral decay often preceded political collapse. Merchants noted that trade routes were becoming riskier. But these voices were scattered and disconnected, drowned out by official optimism. Optimism, in this context, was not hope, it was denial. The illusion of invincibility also distorted decision-making. Leaders took greater risks, assuming success was guaranteed. Diplomatic compromises were rejected as unnecessary. Harsh policies were enforced without fear of backlash. After all, who could challenge the empire? This arrogance accelerated decline. Each unchallenged decision removed another safeguard. Each ignored warning allowed another weakness to deepen. By the time reality could no longer be denied, the systems designed to respond had already failed. The most tragic aspect of the illusion was that it felt rational. Evidence of strength was everywhere. The empire was still rich, still vast, still feared. To doubt its permanence seemed irrational, even disloyal. And so belief reinforced itself, feeding a cycle that made correction increasingly impossible. Invincibility, once questioned, might have been examined. Once accepted, it became unquestionable. In the end, the empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it believed it could never be weak. This belief shaped policies, culture, and identity until adaptation became impossible. By the time the illusion shattered, the empire had lost the ability to respond, not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked humility. History would remember this era not as the height of power, but as the moment certainty blinded a civilization.
Behind the empire's gleaming facade of order and prosperity, a quieter war was being fought, one without banners or battlefields, but no less destructive. It unfolded in council chambers, private estates, and whispered conversations behind golden walls. While the people celebrated unity, the ruling class fractured into rival factions, each fighting for influence, survival, and control of the future. The empire's political system had once been its greatest strength. Clear chains of authority, balanced institutions, and shared responsibility had ensured stability for generations. But over time, success bred complacency, and complacency eroded discipline. Power, once exercised with caution, became something to be hoarded. At the center stood the High Council, a body meant to represent wisdom and continuity. In theory, it governed alongside the monarch to prevent tyranny. In practice, it became a battlefield of ambition. Counselors no longer debated what was best for the empire, but what best secured their own position. Votes were traded like currency. Alliances shifted weekly. Public unity masked private hostility. Decisions were delayed not because solutions were unclear, but because compromise threatened influence. The monarch, once a unifying figure, grew increasingly isolated. Surrounded by advisors who filtered information to suit their agendas, the ruler saw only fragments of reality. Bad news was softened, then removed entirely. Success was exaggerated. Failure was blamed on distant officials who could not defend themselves. In this environment, truth became dangerous. Provincial governors learned quickly that honesty carried risk. Reports describing unrest, corruption, or resource shortages were rewritten to appear manageable. No one wanted to be known as the bearer of problems. Promotion favored loyalty over competence, and the empire slowly filled its leadership ranks with men and women skilled in politics, not governance. Corruption followed naturally. What began as minor favors and exemptions evolved into systemic exploitation. Tax collectors skimmed revenue. Contractors inflated costs. Military suppliers delivered inferior equipment while charging premium prices. Everyone assumed someone else was watching. No one truly was. The wealth of the empire masked this decay. As long as the treasury appeared full, inefficiency was tolerated. Losses were absorbed. Accountability was postponed. Corruption did not collapse the system overnight. It weakened it gradually, invisibly. Factionalism deepened the damage. Political families and regional blocs competed relentlessly. Each sought control over key institutions, the army, the courts, the treasury. Instead of cooperation, governance became obstruction. Policies proposed by one faction were rejected by another, not because they were flawed, but because success would empower rivals. Critical reforms stalled, infrastructure aged, military readiness declined, legal systems grew inconsistent. The empire still functioned, but less efficiently with each passing year. Beyond the council halls, the consequences spread. Provincial officials, seeing corruption rewarded at the top, adopted the same behavior. Bribes became expected. Justice favored the wealthy. Ordinary citizens learned that loyalty mattered less than connections. Trust in institutions eroded quietly, replaced by cynicism. People obeyed the law because they had to, not because they believed in it. The military, once insulated from politics, was drawn into the struggle.
Command appointments became political rewards. Units loyal to specific leaders received better funding. Strategic decisions were influenced by personal rivalry rather than necessity. The army remained large, but its unity fractured. In times of peace, these divisions were survivable. In times of crisis, they would be catastrophic. The most dangerous decisions were those made for short-term advantage. Leaders postponed hard choices, tax reform, military restructuring, border consolidation, because they risked popularity. Instead, they borrowed from the future, draining reserves and exhausting goodwill. Each decision alone seemed reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern of decay. Intellectual life also suffered. Scholars who criticized the system lost patronage. Thinkers who challenged orthodox views were labeled disruptive. Innovation slowed as conformity became safer than creativity. The empire continued to celebrate knowledge, but it increasingly feared new ideas. Silence replaced debate. Within the palaces, luxury insulated decision-makers from reality. Golden halls, endless banquets, and constant entertainment created an illusion of control. It was easy to believe in stability when surrounded by wealth. It was easy to ignore distant suffering when comfort was immediate. The walls did not merely protect the rulers, they blinded them. Outside those walls, provincial populations felt abandoned. Resources flowed toward the capital, while infrastructure decayed elsewhere. Soldiers stationed on remote borders waited months for supplies. Farmers faced higher taxes without increased protection. Loyalty weakened, not through rebellion, but through exhaustion. Still, the empire endured. From the outside, it appeared strong. From within, it was slowly poisoning itself. Each compromised principle, each delayed reform, each tolerated injustice weakened the foundation. The decay was not dramatic enough to inspire fear, but it was persistent enough to ensure failure. Historians would later struggle to identify a single moment when everything went wrong. That was the point. The collapse was not born of one betrayal or one bad ruler. It was the cumulative result of countless small decisions made in pursuit of power rather than preservation. By the time leaders recognized the depth of the problem, the system could no longer correct itself. Trust was gone. Unity was fractured. Institutions existed, but their spirit had hollowed out.
Empires rarely collapse from the top down. They weaken from the ground up. While senators debated policy beneath gilded ceilings and generals argued strategy over maps, the people below the throne lived a different reality. One shaped not by speeches, but by hunger, fatigue, and quiet fear. They were the soldiers guarding distant borders, the farmers feeding cities they would never see, the traders risking their lives on unstable roads, and the slaves whose suffering was invisible by design. They felt the cracks first. For the soldier stationed on the frontier, the empire no longer felt invincible. Forts that once received regular supplies now waited weeks, sometimes months, for reinforcements. Armor grew old. Weapons were repaired instead of replaced. Pay arrived late or not at all. Officers spoke proudly of imperial strength, yet asked their men to endure shortages without explanation. These soldiers were loyal, but loyalty eroded when survival became uncertain. They watched unfamiliar enemies test the borders, probing weaknesses. They sent reports warning of new tactics and growing numbers. Most of those messages disappeared into the bureaucracy, unanswered. At night, by dying campfires, veterans spoke quietly of decline. Younger recruits listened, uneasy. The empire still demanded obedience, but it no longer offered reassurance. Far from the borders, farmers carried a different burden. The land remained fertile, but the pressure grew heavier each year. Taxes increased subtly, justified as temporary measures for the greater good. Grain quotas rose even when harvests failed. Officials cared more about meeting numbers than understanding conditions.
When drought struck, relief arrived late. When floods destroyed fields, compensation vanished into administrative delays. Farmers sold tools, then land, then their future. Many abandoned ancestral farms to seek work in cities, swelling populations already strained by poverty. They did not curse the empire openly. They blamed fate, weather, bad luck. But resentment settled deep, passed quietly from parent to child. Traders and merchants traveled roads that no longer felt safe. Once protected by imperial patrols, trade routes became increasingly dangerous. Bandits grew bolder. Corrupt officials demanded bribes at checkpoints. Insurance costs rose. Profits shrank. Small traders suffered most. A single lost caravan could ruin a family. Complaints to authorities were acknowledged politely and ignored. The empire still spoke of economic prosperity, but those words rang hollow to men and women counting losses in empty ledgers. Some traders adapted, smuggling goods to avoid taxes. Others abandoned legal trade entirely. Each choice weakened the system further, though few saw an alternative. In the cities, life was loud but fragile. Public games and festivals continued, but beneath the noise lay desperation. Employment became unstable, prices rose faster than wages, housing grew crowded as rural families arrived with nowhere else to go. Crime increased, not violently at first, but quietly. Theft, fraud, and bribery became survival tools. Trust between neighbors thinned. The empire still promised order, but enforcement felt selective, favoring the connected and wealthy. Justice no longer felt blind, it felt bought. For slaves, life had always been harsh, but even they sensed change. Demand for labor increased as free citizens fell into poverty. Conditions worsened. Punishments grew harsher as owners sought greater productivity. Slaves heard rumors carried by traders and soldiers. They knew borders were unstable. They knew unrest was spreading. Some dreamed of escape. Others dreamed only of rest. Their suffering was ignored by the state, yet their labor supported its grandeur. They were the foundation no one acknowledged. What united all these lives was silence. People complained privately, rarely publicly. Open dissent still felt dangerous. The empire punished rebellion harshly, and memory of past crackdowns lingered. Fear kept grievances fragmented, isolated within households and villages. But silence does not mean acceptance. In taverns, markets, and military camps, conversations changed tone. Pride faded. Questions emerged. Why were sacrifices always demanded from the same people? Why did prosperity feel distant despite constant labor? Why did leaders speak of strength while lives grew harder? These questions did not yet form a movement. They formed something more dangerous: disillusionment. The empire had long relied on a social contract, security and stability in exchange for obedience. As that contract weakened, loyalty became conditional. People followed laws because they had to, not because they believed in them. The most painful realization for many was not suffering itself, but invisibility. They felt unseen by those who ruled them. Decisions were made far away by people untouched by consequence. Policies arrived as orders, not explanations. Appeals disappeared into systems designed to delay rather than resolve. When disasters struck, a failed harvest, a lost battle, a closed trade route, the people adapted as they always had. But adaptation without support breeds bitterness. Still, rebellion did not come easily. Most people wanted the empire to survive. It was their identity, their history, their home. They remembered better times. They hoped decline was temporary. Hope delayed resistance. Yet hope alone could not repair roads, feed families, or restore trust. Slowly, something shifted. Soldiers became less eager to enforce harsh orders. Farmers hid grain. Traders bypassed official routes. Slaves resisted quietly, working slower, sabotaging tools, passing messages. None of this made headlines. None of it seemed revolutionary, but together it weakened the empire more effectively than any enemy. Because an empire does not stand on stone and steel alone. It stands on belief, on cooperation, on the willingness of ordinary people to carry extraordinary weight. And that willingness was fading. From the throne, the empire still looked magnificent. From below, it felt heavy, distant, and increasingly indifferent.
Enemies beyond the horizon. Every empire believes its greatest threats lie within its borders: rebellion, decay, disorder. But history is less forgiving. While the empire struggled with its own internal fractures, forces beyond its horizons were watching carefully, patiently, and with growing confidence. They did not rush, they observed. Beyond the empire's vast frontiers stretched lands long dismissed as backward or insignificant. For generations, imperial scholars had described these regions as fragmented, primitive, and incapable of unity. Maps reduced them to margins. Reports minimized their importance. The empire had conquered before, and what it had not conquered it believed could wait. That belief would prove costly. To the north, tribal confederations, once scattered and divided, had begun to change. Pressure from imperial expansion forced them closer together. Trade with imperial merchants exposed them to new technologies, weapons, and tactics. Former enemies became allies out of necessity. They learned quickly. Imperial arrogance blinded its leaders to the fact that power invites imitation. Roads built for conquest became channels of knowledge. Veterans who deserted or were captured taught imperial strategies to those once considered incapable of understanding them. What the empire saw as superiority, others saw as a manual. Along the eastern borders, a rival state rose quietly. Its leaders studied imperial governance with ruthless efficiency. They adopted centralized administration, professional armies, and disciplined taxation without the excess and corruption that plagued the empire. While imperial councils argued over prestige, this rival invested in preparation. Their cities lacked marble palaces, but their granaries were full. Their armies lacked ceremony, but their discipline was absolute. Imperial diplomats dismissed them as imitators, never equals. To the south, unrest simmered within territories the empire believed firmly under control. These were not foreign enemies, but subject peoples, conquered generations ago, taxed heavily, and governed from afar. They remembered independence. They remembered injustice. Rebels did not rise openly. They learned from history. They organized in secrecy, using religious gatherings, trade networks, and family ties to pass messages. Weapons were hidden, supplies stockpiled. Leaders emerged slowly, carefully. Imperial governors reported stability, unaware or unwilling to admit that loyalty was dissolving beneath their authority. Even pirates and bandits sensed opportunity. Imperial patrols thinned as resources were redirected inward. Trade routes weakened. Small groups tested defenses, retreating when challenged, returning when ignored. Each success emboldened them. These were not coordinated threats yet. What united them was patience. The empire still commanded fear, but fear had changed. It was no longer paralyzing. It was instructional. Enemies learned what not to do. They avoided direct confrontation. They attacked supply lines instead of armies, morale instead of walls. From the capital, these dangers appeared distant and manageable. Border skirmishes were framed as routine. Rebellions were labeled isolated incidents. Rival powers were underestimated deliberately because acknowledging them would require change. Change was inconvenient. Military commanders sent cautious warnings. They spoke of new alliances forming beyond the borders, of tactics that neutralized imperial advantages, of enemies who did not fight as expected.
These warnings were received politely and filed away. The empire had defeated barbarians before. Why would this be different? Because the world beyond the horizon was no longer reacting, it was planning. In distant camps, leaders studied imperial weaknesses. They knew the empire's armies were large but slow. They knew internal divisions weakened response times. They knew loyalty among border troops was eroding. They waited for the right moment, when pressure from within would limit resistance from without. That moment was approaching. Inside the empire, signs were visible to those willing to look. Trade slowed as merchants avoided risky routes. Border towns emptied. Refugees arrived with stories of unrest and foreign movements. These stories were dismissed as exaggeration, spread by fearful people. Fear, after all, was inconvenient to stability. The most dangerous enemies were those the empire created itself. Every harsh tax, every ignored grievance, every corrupt official strengthened the resolve of rebels. Every arrogant dismissal pushed rivals closer together. The empire's reputation for invincibility discouraged diplomacy and encouraged resistance. Why negotiate with a power that refused to listen? As tensions rose, some leaders beyond the horizon began to believe something unprecedented, that the empire could be beaten. This belief spread quietly, but once planted, it grew fast. The empire still possessed unmatched resources, but its enemies understood something crucial. Power unused correctly becomes a burden. Maintaining vast territories drained manpower. Suppressing unrest diverted armies. Internal fighting delayed decisions. The empire was strong, but inflexible. One by one, rival leaders tested it. A border raid here, a rebellion there, a disrupted trade route. Each time, the empire responded, slowly, unevenly, and at great cost. Victories were claimed, but they felt increasingly hollow. Enemies learned that the empire reacted rather than anticipated. The horizon darkened. Still, within the capital, celebrations continued. Triumphs were announced, threats minimized. The empire preferred reassurance to realism. To acknowledge danger would undermine confidence, and confidence, leaders believed, was the foundation of order. They did not understand that denial weakens more than fear. Beyond the borders, preparations accelerated. Alliances were formalized. Leaders coordinated timing. Rebels awaited signals. Rivals stockpiled supplies. They did not seek immediate destruction. They sought exhaustion. They understood that the empire's greatest enemy was not them, it was itself. When the moment came, it would not arrive as a single invasion or uprising. It would arrive as a convergence, pressure from every direction, timed precisely when the empire was least prepared to respond.
History rarely collapses without warning. It whispers long before it screams. In the final years of the empire's golden age, signs appeared everywhere, subtle at first, then unmistakable. They emerged in the heavens, in the halls of power, on distant borders, and in the daily lives of ordinary people. Yet each warning, no matter how clear, was met with disbelief, dismissal, or deliberate silence. The empire did not fall because it lacked knowledge. It fell because it refused to listen. The first warnings came dressed as coincidence. Unseasonal storms flooded fertile valleys, ruining crops that had fed cities for generations. Drought followed flood, breaking patterns once considered reliable. Priests debated the meaning of these events, but official sermons framed them as temporary trials, not omens. To suggest divine displeasure was uncomfortable. It threatened certainty. Astronomers recorded strange movements in the sky, comets burning brighter than any living memory, eclipses lingering longer than expected. Scholars argued over their significance.
Some insisted they marked transitions in history, moments of instability. Others mocked such interpretations as superstition. The court favored the skeptics. Prophets and mystics, once respected voices on the fringes of power, found themselves ignored or quietly silenced. Their warnings were unsettling. They spoke of arrogance, imbalance, and a reckoning approaching from beyond the horizon. They did not name dates or enemies. They spoke of consequences. That ambiguity made them easy to dismiss. Within the bureaucracy, more practical warnings appeared. Border commanders sent urgent reports describing coordinated movements among rival powers. Supply officers warned of shrinking reserves. Engineers reported the slow decay of roads, walls, and fortifications. These were not dramatic messages. They lacked spectacle. They demanded attention, resources, and difficult choices. So they were postponed. Councils debated the tone of these reports rather than their content. Words like concerning replaced dangerous, manageable replaced urgent. The empire's language softened reality until it no longer resembled truth. Political advisors learned that alarm was unwelcome. Careers stalled when warnings proved inconvenient. Promotion favored optimism. Over time, even those who saw the danger learned to temper their voices. Self-censorship became policy. One of the clearest warnings came in the form of small failures. A border city fell, not dramatically, but through neglect. Supplies ran out. Reinforcements arrived late. The loss was framed as strategic withdrawal. The public was told it meant nothing. In truth, it meant everything. Elsewhere, rebellions flared briefly, then disappeared. Officials reported order restored. They did not report the cost. They did not report the resentment that followed. Each suppressed uprising left scars, not solutions. The empire mistook silence for stability. Economic signs followed. Currency debasement began quietly, justified as a temporary measure. Prices rose unevenly. Trust in markets weakened. Merchants adjusted. Citizens absorbed the cost. Economists warned of long-term consequences. They were accused of lacking faith. Even within the military, warning signs multiplied. Training exercises revealed weaknesses. Units failed drills that once seemed routine. Commanders requested reform. Tradition answered instead. The army had always adapted eventually. Why rush now? Because time was no longer on the empire's side. Perhaps the most tragic warnings came from those who loved the empire most. Veterans spoke of declining morale. Teachers noticed changes in students, less pride, more cynicism. Judges saw respect for law erode. These were cultural signals, difficult to measure but impossible to ignore, unless ignoring them was easier. The leadership clung to image. Public ceremonies grew more elaborate. Victories were announced with greater fanfare. Propaganda intensified. The empire did not seek to understand its problems. It sought to outshine them. In doing so, it trained its people to distrust reality. When a respected general finally spoke openly before the council, urging immediate reform and caution, his words fell into uncomfortable silence. He was thanked for his service and reassigned to an honorary position far from influence. The message was clear. Truth had limits. Outside the capital, fear spread quietly. Refugees carried stories of unrest and foreign armies. Priests in rural temples spoke in hushed tones of judgment. Old songs about fallen civilizations resurfaced. Memory, unlike power, is patient. The final warnings came close together. A major trade route collapsed under sustained attacks. A once loyal province refused to send taxes. A natural disaster exposed the empire's slow response and internal confusion. Each event alone was survivable. Together, they formed a pattern. But patterns require recognition. The empire's greatest failing was not ignorance, but arrogance. It believed itself too complex, too powerful, too important to follow the same rules as others. History was something that happened to lesser civilizations. Warnings challenged that belief, so they were denied. By the time the signs could no longer be explained away, it was too late. Systems meant to respond had weakened. Trust had eroded. Unity had fractured. The warnings that once whispered now shouted, but the empire had forgotten to listen. Historians would later note the irony. The fall was predicted repeatedly, from multiple directions, in multiple forms. The evidence was overwhelming, and still nothing changed. The tragedy of the empire was not that fate was cruel, but that choice was ignored. At countless moments, leaders could have acted differently. Reforms could have been made, alliances reconsidered, resources redirected.
The turning point. Every great collapse is traced back to a single moment, not because it caused everything, but because it revealed everything. For the empire, that moment came not during a battle, nor through rebellion, but inside the capital itself, within a chamber built to decide the fate of millions. The signs had accumulated for years. The warnings had grown louder. The threats had drawn closer. And yet, when the moment arrived that demanded courage over comfort, the empire chose familiarity. It chose wrong. The council was assembled under urgent summons. Messengers had arrived from the northern frontier, carrying reports unlike any before. Rival forces had united, not temporarily, but under a single command. Border fortresses were under pressure. Supply lines were compromised. The generals demanded immediate reinforcement and strategic withdrawal from overextended regions. For the first time in decades, fear entered the council hall. Maps were unrolled across polished tables. Red markings showed enemy movements spreading like veins. Silence followed each report. The empire's defenses, once assumed unbreakable, now appeared thin, scattered, and slow to respond. The choice was clear, but difficult. The generals proposed a decisive shift: consolidate borders, abandon certain territories, reform command structures, and recall legions from ceremonial postings. It would mean admitting weakness. It would mean sacrifice, economic loss, political backlash, and wounded pride. But it would preserve the core. Opposition came swiftly. Counselors argued that withdrawal would invite rebellion, that reform would undermine tradition, that retreat would shatter public confidence. They warned that panic, not enemies, posed the greatest threat. The debate did not center on survival. It centered on appearance. The monarch listened in silence, weighing not only strategy, but legacy. Advisors whispered concerns about unrest in the capital. Merchants warned of market collapse if trade routes were abandoned. Priests cautioned that retreat could be interpreted as divine abandonment. No one asked what would happen if the generals were right. As the hours passed, urgency faded into procedure. Fear softened into calculation. The moment narrowed. Then the decision was made. The council rejected consolidation. Borders would hold. No territories would be abandoned. The empire would demonstrate strength through presence, not prudence. Reinforcements would be limited. Reform postponed. Tradition preserved. The message was clear. The empire would not bend. Cheers followed, forced but loud. Confidence was restored, at least on the surface. Orders were dispatched, declaring unity and resolve. Public announcements framed the decision as bold leadership. The empire had chosen pride over preparation. On the frontier, the consequences unfolded quickly. Legions, already stretched thin, were ordered to maintain positions without additional support. Supplies failed to arrive. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they had been sacrificed for symbolism. Commanders, stripped of flexibility, fought according to outdated doctrine against enemies who had learned their weaknesses.
The first major defeat was swift and shocking. An imperial force, once considered elite, was surrounded and destroyed. Survivors fled, carrying stories that contradicted official announcements. Refugees followed, spreading fear faster than any enemy army. The illusion shattered, but too late. Within the empire, trust evaporated. People remembered the council's promises and compared them to reality. Traders halted movement. Provinces hesitated to send resources. Soldiers questioned orders. The turning point had passed, and its consequences rippled outward. Enemies sensed it immediately. Rival powers launched coordinated offensives. Rebels rose, no longer fearing swift suppression. Border cities fell one by one, not through overwhelming force, but through exhaustion and betrayal. The empire responded, but slowly. Decision-making fractured under pressure. Factions blamed one another. Generals argued over authority. The monarch, once distant, now overwhelmed, issued conflicting orders. Systems designed for stability failed under stress. The moment for reform had passed. What made this turning point irreversible was not the decision itself, but what it revealed. The empire had lost its ability to choose survival over pride. It could no longer adapt without shattering its identity. History had shifted. Citizens felt it in subtle ways at first. News grew inconsistent. Taxes increased suddenly. Military conscription expanded. Public ceremonies became desperate affirmations rather than celebrations. The empire still stood, but it was no longer whole. Looking back, historians would debate this moment endlessly. Some would argue that no decision could have saved the empire. Others would insist that reform might have preserved it for generations. But all agreed on one thing. This was the moment when decline became destiny. Because before the turning point, the empire still had choices. After it, only reactions. The tragedy was not that leaders lacked intelligence or courage. It was that they believed strength meant never yielding. They misunderstood the nature of power. True strength adapts, it changes, it survives. The empire chose to appear strong instead. That single decision did not destroy the empire immediately, but it removed its future. From that moment forward, every action was constrained, every response delayed, every sacrifice heavier.
Fire, blood, and broken crowns. Order did not vanish in a single moment. It unraveled. What began as distant defeats quickly transformed into internal collapse. News arrived faster than explanations, and fear spread faster than truth. Cities that had once slept peacefully under imperial banners now woke to uncertainty, rumors, and the sound of marching boots. The empire had entered its final season. War no longer lived at the borders. It moved inward, following fractured roads and broken loyalties. Frontier provinces fell in rapid succession, not because the empire lacked soldiers, but because it lacked coordination. Commanders received conflicting orders, supply lines collapsed, units fought bravely, then retreated, then dissolved. Victory was no longer expected. Betrayal accelerated what war began. Provincial governors, sensing the center's weakness, made desperate calculations. Some declared neutrality, withholding taxes and troops. Others pledged loyalty to rival powers in exchange for protection. Oaths, once sworn with pride, were abandoned in silence. The empire's authority fractured into fragments, each claiming legitimacy, none able to enforce it. Inside the capital, panic replaced confidence. Markets closed, food prices soared, riots erupted where order once prevailed. Imperial guards, unpaid and overworked, struggled to maintain control. Some joined the mobs, others disappeared entirely.
The throne still stood, but power no longer obeyed it. The monarch issued decrees promising stability, reform, and victory. Each proclamation rang weaker than the last. Words had lost their force. The people no longer believed. The High Council turned inward, consumed by blame. Accusations replaced strategy. Old rivalries erupted openly. Meetings ended without decisions. Decisions, when made, arrived too late. Trust collapsed alongside order. The military, once the empire's backbone, shattered under pressure. Units loyal to different commanders refused cooperation. Some deserted, others defected. Veterans watched in disbelief as the institution they had served became unrecognizable. Battlefields multiplied. Enemy forces advanced, but they did not need overwhelming numbers. They exploited confusion. They seized supply depots abandoned by fleeing officials. They recruited from populations long resentful of imperial rule. The empire was fighting itself as much as its enemies. Civil war followed close behind invasion. Claimants to power emerged, each wearing fragments of imperial legitimacy. Generals declared themselves protectors of the realm. Noble families raised private armies. Former allies clashed in the streets of cities built for commerce, not combat. The capital became a prize and a prison. Fires burned through districts untouched by war for centuries. Libraries collapsed. Temples were looted. Artifacts of 1,000 years were destroyed in nights of chaos. No side spared what they could not control. The past was consumed alongside the present. Betrayal reached the highest levels. A trusted commander opened the city gates to enemy forces, believing resistance was futile. A council faction attempted a coup, promising order in exchange for submission. The crown itself was contested, not by outsiders, but by those sworn to defend it. Power changed hands quickly, then violently. When the throne finally fell, it was not dramatic. There was no final speech, no heroic last stand. The crown was abandoned by guards who had not been paid. The crown was removed, not seized, carried away by hands that no longer believed it meant anything. The symbol of unity became an artifact of the past. In the streets, survival replaced ideology. Families fled, slaves escaped or were killed. Soldiers became mercenaries. Loyalty dissolved into necessity. The empire no longer existed as a coherent force, only as memories, ruins, and scattered claimants. Even after the fighting slowed, order did not return. Former imperial lands fragmented into smaller states, each inheriting resentment, poverty, and violence. Borders shifted constantly. Trade networks collapsed. Knowledge was lost. Infrastructure decayed beyond repair. What had taken centuries to build unraveled in years. Historians would later argue about causes: corruption, arrogance, overextension. All were true, but none alone explain the speed of the collapse. The empire did not fall simply because enemies attacked. It fell because belief died. Belief in leadership, belief in justice, belief in shared destiny. Once that belief was gone, no army could restore order. The collapse of power revealed an uncomfortable truth. Authority without trust is illusion, and illusions shatter under pressure. The empire's end was not marked by conquest alone, but by abandonment, by citizens, soldiers, and leaders who no longer recognized it as worth saving. Fire consumed the cities. Blood soaked the roads. Crowns shattered on stone floors. And history moved on.
After the fall. When the noise of war faded, silence took its place. It was not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one, broken by distant cries, collapsing structures, and the wind moving through ruins where life once thrived. The empire was gone, not defeated in a single battle, but emptied of meaning, authority, and belief. What remained were survivors, standing among the remnants of a civilization they no longer recognized. Cities bore the clearest scars. Streets that once carried traders and processions were choked with debris. Burned homes leaned against shattered temples. Statues of emperors lay face down in the dust, their inscriptions cracked, their promises unreadable. Markets reopened slowly, cautiously, serving fewer people with less to sell. The grandeur that once defined the empire now felt distant, almost imaginary. For those who survived the collapse, daily life became an act of reconstruction, not of monuments or institutions, but of routines, finding food, securing shelter, protecting family, trusting neighbors again. Former soldiers returned home without banners or honors. Many carried wounds that would never heal. They spoke little of battles, but much of confusion, orders that changed overnight, allies who vanished, commanders who fled. They had fought for an empire that no longer existed, and now they struggled to find purpose in its absence. Farmers reclaimed abandoned land, often without knowing who now ruled it. Borders meant little. Authority shifted constantly. Taxes were demanded by new powers, sometimes multiple in the same season. Survival required negotiation, compromise, and quiet endurance. Traders adapted quickly or disappeared entirely. Without imperial roads and protection, commerce shrank. Barter replaced currency in many regions. Knowledge of safe routes became more valuable than gold. Trust became local, personal. Slaves, where they survived, experienced uncertain freedom. Some were released in chaos, others escaped during the fighting. But freedom without structure proved fragile. Many faced hunger and violence in lands that no longer offered protection. Liberation came without justice. The collapse had leveled hierarchy, but not suffering. Amid the ruins, questions began to surface. In taverns rebuilt from debris and temples purposed as shelters, people talked, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. They asked how a civilization so powerful could vanish so completely. They debated responsibility. Some blamed corrupt leaders, others blamed foreign enemies, many blamed fate. A few blamed themselves. Scholars, if they survived, began the slow work of memory. They gathered fragmented records, eyewitness accounts, and broken laws. They argued not to restore the empire, but to understand it. Their writings carried a new tone, not celebration, but caution. They wrote of arrogance mistaken for strength, of unity assumed rather than earned, of systems that served power instead of people. Religion shifted as well. Temples once devoted to imperial glory became places of mourning and reflection. Priests spoke less of destiny and more of humility. The gods, once claimed as protectors of empire, now were asked for forgiveness and guidance. Faith turned inward. Children grew up among ruins, hearing stories of a time they could not imagine. To them, the empire was myth. Its roads were broken paths. Its laws were fragments quoted by elders. Its greatness felt abstract, disconnected from their reality. Memory, like power, faded. New leaders emerged, cautious and fragmented. They ruled smaller territories, aware of the empire's fate. Some sought to rebuild centralized authority. Others rejected it entirely. The future unfolded unevenly, shaped by lessons learned and forgotten. The greatest change was invisible.
The collapse altered how people understood permanence. The idea that any system could last forever was gone. Skepticism replaced certainty. Survival replaced pride. Communities valued adaptability over dominance. The empire's fall became a warning whispered across generations. Among the ruins, survivors slowly accepted a difficult truth. The empire did not fail suddenly, it failed gradually, through choices repeated until alternatives disappeared. By the time destruction came, it merely revealed what had already been lost. Responsibility was shared. Leaders had failed, yes, but so had institutions, traditions, and beliefs. The people had trusted too easily. They had remained silent too long. They had confused comfort with security. Understanding this did not ease their pain, but it gave it meaning. As years passed, ruins were repurposed. Stones from palaces built homes. Broken columns became foundations. Life continued, quieter but resilient. The empire did not return. But from its ashes emerged something humbler, a civilization aware of its fragility, a people shaped by memory rather than myth.
Lessons written in ashes. The empire had fallen. Its streets were empty, its banners gone, and its monuments reduced to rubble. Yet in destruction it spoke, if anyone was willing to listen. Centuries later, historians, philosophers, and ordinary people still returned to the ruins, seeking lessons buried beneath layers of ash, blood, and memory. The first lesson was clear. Power without accountability is fragile. The empire had expanded, conquering vast territories, accumulating wealth, and creating a network of bureaucracy so vast it could have been its greatest strength. Yet, unchecked, that power eroded itself. Leaders prioritized pride over prudence. Advisors preferred flattery over truth. Institutions became shells of their former purpose. When authority operates without feedback, without honesty, it invites disaster. Modern societies often face similar temptations. Large organizations, governments, or even tech monopolies may appear stable because they dominate their fields, yet fragility can lurk within. Oversight, transparency, and self-reflection are not optional, they are essential. Ignoring warning signs, even small ones, can accumulate into catastrophic consequences. The second lesson, complacency is the enemy of survival. For generations, the empire had flourished. Its soldiers believed they could not be defeated. Its merchants believed wealth was eternal. Its citizens believed that tradition guaranteed safety. Confidence became hubris. Risk was minimized until it could no longer be managed. By the time collapse arrived, there were no mechanisms to respond swiftly, no resilience to absorb shock. In the modern world, complacency takes subtler forms. Economies can overextend themselves. Technology can outpace regulation. Climate change, social unrest, or political polarization, ignored today, can cascade into crises tomorrow. The empire teaches that stability is earned daily, not assumed because it existed yesterday. A third lesson emerged from the human cost. Systems fail, but people endure. Soldiers, farmers, merchants, slaves, all those who had carried the weight of the empire's grandeur experienced the first fractures and the greatest consequences. They adapted, fled, resisted, and survived, often without recognition. Civilizations collapse, yet humans persist. Lives, relationships, and communities find ways to rebuild even when structures crumble. For the modern observer, this underscores the resilience inherent in humanity. Policies, governments, and institutions are important, but so is the capacity of ordinary people to adapt.
investing in social cohesion, education, and community support is as critical as building walls or armies. People are the true foundation of stability, and neglecting them accelerates decline. Fourth, denial magnifies disaster. Throughout its fall, the empire ignored signs, prophecies, reports, natural disasters, and social unrest. Advisors whispered warnings, generals pleaded, and scholars wrote urgently, yet their messages were filtered, minimized, or silenced. Leaders chose comfort over truth, appearance over reality. The empire did not fail overnight, it failed over decades of denial. Modern parallels are undeniable. Climate scientists, economists, and sociologists issue warnings that are often deferred, disputed, or ignored. The empire reminds us that acknowledging inconvenient truths is not weakness, it is survival. Denial magnifies vulnerability. Acting early, even imperfectly, can prevent catastrophe. Fifth, fragility often grows within strength. The empire appeared unbreakable. Its armies were large, its walls tall, its treasury full. But internal weaknesses, corruption, bureaucracy, and factionalism were invisible to those at the center. From a distance, the empire radiated stability. From within, it teetered on the edge. For contemporary societies, this teaches humility. Prosperity does not guarantee resilience. Confidence should not obscure scrutiny. Systems must be stress-tested, governments monitored, and assumptions regularly challenged. Strength can hide fragility until it is too late to correct course. Sixth, history is cyclical if lessons are ignored. The empire was not the first to rise and fall, nor would it be the last. Across time, civilizations repeat mistakes, overexpansion, internal division, neglect of warning signs, and prioritization of pride over prudence. By studying past failures, modern societies gain foresight. Ignoring them invites repetition. This is particularly relevant today. Global powers, while powerful, are not immune to overreach. Societies that fail to invest in justice, equality, and adaptability invite systemic stress. Leadership matters, but culture and values matter more. The empire warns that ignoring history is a perilous choice. Seventh, resilience is a social construct as much as a structural one. After the fall, survivors rebuilt not through imperial edicts, but through cooperation, innovation, and adaptation. New communities formed, local leaders emerged, and trade restarted along smaller, safer routes. The ashes did not prevent life, they redirected it. Modern societies can draw a lesson here. Disaster preparedness is not only about infrastructure or defense, it is about social trust, local governance, and networks of care. Resilient societies anticipate shocks and empower citizens to act, not simply hope rulers will manage crises. Eighth, legacy is fragile. The empire spent centuries constructing monuments, writing laws, and cultivating culture. Yet within decades of collapse, much of that physical legacy was destroyed. Memory survived partially through stories, fragments, and scholars who persisted. Legacy depends not only on creation, but on stewardship, teaching, and adaptation. This resonates today. Institutions, monuments, knowledge, and achievements are only meaningful if maintained and shared responsibly. Preserving wisdom, ethics, and communal memory safeguards future generations against repeating past errors. Ninth, unity is inseparable from trust. The empire fell as factions, provinces, and leaders turned against one another. Authority without belief is empty. Laws without legitimacy are ignored. Coordination without trust collapses under pressure. People may comply superficially, but true cohesion requires confidence in leadership and shared purpose. For modern nations, this lesson is profound. Political polarization, social inequality, and distrust can erode cohesion faster than external threats. Investing in legitimacy, accountability, and dialogue strengthens societies in ways armies and wealth cannot. Finally, the empire teaches humility. No civilization is eternal. No matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how confident, all systems face entropy. Time, mismanagement, human error, and unforeseen external pressures ensure impermanence. Recognizing mortality in nations, in institutions, in oneself is the first step toward enduring wisdom. In the ashes, there is hope. While the empire's grandeur is gone, its lessons endure. Modern civilizations have the privilege of hindsight. They can study the collapse, reflect on the signs, and choose differently. They can prioritize accountability over pride, adaptability over rigidity, and humanity over mere survival. Survivors of the empire rebuilt their world, not by restoring what was lost, but by learning from it. Roads were repaired, markets reopened, laws were rewritten. Communities formed new identities rooted in reflection rather than illusion. The past became a teacher, not a ruler. For the modern observer, this is the ultimate lesson. Power is transient, but wisdom can endure. Civilization is fragile, history is instructive, and the choices made today echo far into the future. A society that listens, adapts, and invests in trust and resilience can survive shocks that destroyed others. The ashes of the empire are not merely remnants, they are mirrors. They reflect what happens when pride overrides prudence.